Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, depending upon where you are. I'm Norbert Acosta, President of the Toronto branch of the World Federalist Movement of Canada. I welcome you all to today's event. I speak to you from Brampton, Ontario, a part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. If you have attended any of our previous events, you would have heard this land acknowledgement before. It is worth repeating. Brampton is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. The dish represents the land, and the spoon represents the peoples of the treaty. The treaty is to share the responsibility of ensuring the dish is never empty, which includes taking care of the land and the creatures humans share with it. Importantly, there are no knives at the table, representing that the peoples of the treaty must keep the peace. World Federalists, like the participants in the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, view the world as one society, embracing all of humanity in all its diversity. We call for urgent progress in developing democratic world institutions, which are essential to assure a peaceful, just, and ecologically sustainable world community. Many of you may have attended our previous presentation where Andreas Bummel, co-founder of Democracy Without Borders, talked about a reformed UN by means of a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Glenn T. Martin, Professor of Philosophy Emeritus at Radford University, Executive Director of Earth Constitution Institute, and President of the World Constitution and Parliament Association, who will talk to us about the Earth Constitution and World Parliament. Dedicated for over more than 4 decades to the field of philosophy, Dr. Martin has inspired countless students and colleagues with his intellectual curiosity, his commitment to ethical living, and his passion for exploring the most profound questions of human existence. As a respected scholar, his contributions to the field of ethics, political philosophy, and global studies have left an indelible mark, challenging us to rethink our understanding of justice, democracy, and the role of the individual in the global community. But Dr. Martin's work goes far beyond the walls of academia. His unwavering belief in the power of collective action and the potential of humanity to create a more just, equitable, and sustainable world where humanity's challenges are addressed through cooperation, dialogue, and shared problem solving has led him to champion the cause of global governance reform. Dr. Martin has worked tirelessly to advocate for a more inclusive, democratic, and effective system of global governance. His vision of a world united under a common constitution with shared values and aspirations offers a blueprint for a future where human rights, environmental protection, and social justice are upheld for all people, regardless of nationality, ethnicity, or economic status. Before I pass the virtual floor to Dr. Martin, I'm pleased to inform you that Andreas Bummel and Dr. Martin have agreed to come together on June 3rd this year at our next event. More on this later as we close today's event. I would like to say, if you like today's event and what we have done in the past and what we plan for the future, please consider supporting us by becoming a member or donating to the World Federalist Movement Canada. Following Dr. Martin's talk, we will have a Q&A session moderated by our WFMC Communications Director, Erica Wilson. Please enter any questions you may have in the chat. Erica will put them together and present them to Dr. Martin for comment. Dr. Martin, it's my honor to invite you to take the virtual floor.
Thank you very much.
Norbert.
I've never heard it called a virtual floor before. I like that. In my current book that I'm now working on, it's called Human Dignity and World Order. And my thesis there, which supports the Constitution for the Federation of Earth, which I'll talk about in just a second, my thesis there is that we human beings need to found a world system on human dignity, not on the private accumulation of wealth, which is capitalism, and not on the military sovereign nation states, which deal in power struggles, not in human dignity. And so I argue that the Constitution itself is a work completely founded on human dignity. It doesn't talk about that, as a philosophical concept. That's what I'm doing. But it's founded on the premise of human welfare, individual human rights, and our common human dignity. So if you would keep that in mind while I talk about the structure and function, I think it would be helpful. Let me share screen here. I have a short PowerPoint. My instructions are to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we can open it up for the rest of the session to people's questions and so on. So I'll go through this PowerPoint to my best of my ability in 20 minutes. Let me share screen. Okay, is that visible? Are we okay?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, it's called Structure and Function, the Constitution for the Federation of Earth. And our main website is earthconstitution.world, where you can find the Constitution. And if anyone wants to contact me, my email is there, gmartin@earthconstitution.world. So the Constitution itself, this is the photo of one edition of the Constitution, which came out in 2014. It's called the Pocket Constitution. It's just a little book. It's coming out in a new edition next year, or later this year. But the Constitution was, as you can see, was written by hundreds of world citizens through a process of 4 constituent assemblies between 1968 and 1991. And these 4 were sponsored by the World Constitution and Parliament Association, which was founded in 1958 by Philip Isley and a previous generation of World Federalists. I joined the movement in 1995 when I first found out about it. I'd been a philosopher thinking about peace issues, world peace issues for a number of years. But I never really encountered world government, world federation, until I saw a big advertisement in these times, a magazine that comes out of Chicago, and immediately I went out to their headquarters and found out about it. Their headquarters at that time were in Denver, Colorado, and I began studying it and I've worked with them ever since. So some of these leaders who wrote the Constitution and worked on the Constitution and were part of these 4 constituent assemblies, I knew personally. They've all except one of them has passed away, but I'm kind of the last remaining who has memories of that generation. But it was a great generation of serious global thinkers and world federalists. So the Constitution, you can see on the right side there what the mathematicians call a torus. Right? It's a figure in which there is constant motion and constant integration that is at the same time holistic. And other thinkers as well as myself have thought of this figure as a very nice representation for the Constitution in action. All of the various 17 articles in the Constitution integrate together. They create an integrated world system in which there's no top and no bottom. There's a constant interaction between the people of Earth and the governing bodies of Earth and so on. It's a dynamic system. So it's what is sometimes called a maximalist government. We're not trying to minimize and call it governance like some organizations have done. It's real world government because that's what the people of Earth need if we want a future on this earth which is sustainable and just and nonviolent without war. So you can see it includes global banking and economics, global elections and boundaries, global law enforcement and judicial systems. The worldwide ending of poverty is a mandate for the world government. Global environmental protection is part of the law given to the world government. Administering the global commons, the oceans, the atmosphere, and so on. Enforcing global human rights protections, and ending war and ensuring disarmament. So how does it do this? The key to the Earth Constitution is that it's a parliamentary system. It's not like the system in the United States, which says there's three branches of government, the executive and the legislative and the judicial. And as you probably know, being right next to the United States, many of you and so on, it's a mess here in the United States. The executive, because it's militarized, has gained more and more power. It's immensely powerful. The judicial interferes with much of the popular will of the people on Earth. What the Earth Constitution gives us is a parliamentary system where everybody is represented. But under that parliamentary system, then comes the executive branch and the judicial branch. They're responsible to the people of Earth, the representatives of the people of Earth. These are the main issue is the World Parliament. I'll talk about the three houses in just a moment. There's the world under that. There's the world judiciary, the world executive, the world enforcement system, the world ombudsman, which is a whole branch of government devoted to human rights, and the integrative complex. So the World Parliament, you can see the three houses of the World Parliament at the top of the screen here. And so three houses: House of Peoples, House of Councillors, and House of Nations. The House of Peoples is 1,000 electoral districts, equal in population from around the world. So that means every single person on Earth has a vote who is 18 years old or of age or older, and every person is represented in one of these 1,000 world electoral districts. As a matter of fact, the World Constitutional Parliament Association, have been actually defining these districts for a number of years, and that process is almost completed now, and we will soon begin registering people to vote in these districts. So there's 1,000 representatives in the House of Peoples. The House of Nations on the right side of the screen, there's 1, 2, or 3 representatives from each nation on Earth, depending on population. So small nations, 1, medium-sized nations, 2, and nations over 100,000, 3 representatives. So the big nations would have 3, and so on. Each nation decides how it wants to appoint or elect its representative. So probably, given that this 1, 2, or 3 candidates from each nation, maybe this will have 300 representatives. So you've got 1,000 representatives of the people of Earth directly, 300 from the nations, and in the House of Councillors, you can see, is 200 representatives, and they're chosen from 20 world magna regions defined by the Constitution. So these 20 world regions, all equal, roughly equal in population, each will be choosing 10 representatives to get to the House of Councillors. They are nominated to the House of Councillors by faculty and students in each of those 20 regions. This is an attempt, I think a very beautiful attempt to get wisdom into government, right? To maintain as democratic a system as possible, but to get wise people into government. And I don't know about the governments of the countries other than my own, but I know in my own country, the US, we don't have wise people in any of the branches of our government at the moment that I can tell. And so here we have the World Parliament, which I said is the ultimate authority, about 1,500 persons. And the Constitution describes the various roles of each of these, but all together they make the World Parliament, and many votes require all three houses in joint session. The House of Councillors has a unique role in the Constitution because it is responsible for nominating the people to be elected by the other two houses, the House of Nations, the House of Peoples. It nominates the people who will be leading the world judiciary, the world executive, the enforcement system, and the world ombudsman. So the idea is that these nominations will be good nominations, precisely because the counselors have this vast experience and this wisdom that gives them a special role in the government. Underneath the world executive, you can see in the second row, underneath the executive, there's a world administration, 28 departments covering the entire range of global needs. World education, world transportation, world housing, world food supplies, all of these things that are necessary to create a decent place on planet Earth for everybody to live. Underneath that, you can see the integrative complex of 7 agencies serving all government branches. So there are highly specialized agencies. For example, the Agency of Research and Planning, which is plans for the future of the Earth Federation, the future of planet Earth. Right now, there is no such body on Earth, right? Nations operate mostly off of short-term interests. Capitalism and the rich operate out of fairly short-term interest, the next quarterly profit and so on. And the UN itself has no, even if it has some agencies that think in terms of the future, it has no authority to get people interested in that future. So it looks pretty bleak in the current world system, and this gives us a world system that should work effectively for everybody. So let's look at the next slide. So this is the House of Peoples. I already described that, the three houses, universal adult suffrage, representatives have 5-year terms, and they can be repeatedly elected. Anybody can be removed for cause. Anybody in any of the government agencies under the parliament or anybody in the parliament can be removed by a vote for cause if they are corrupt for some reason. Okay, see the House of Nations here then. Under 10 million, 1 representative, 10 to 100 million to more than 100 million, 3 representatives. So the House of Councillors, their special function is making nominations, as I said. And the World Electoral Region, this is an early map that was done, in fact, by people who, one of whom was from Canada, one of the World Federalists from Canada, worked on this map. And it is defining the 20 magna regions. Each of these 20 magna regions is in turn divided into 50 electoral districts, world electoral districts. So you can see that under the authority of Article 19 of the Earth Constitution, which commands us or requires us to begin working out the infrastructure of the world government even before the Constitution is ratified. because when they wrote it, they had a sense, believe it or not, it was completed in 1991, started in 1968. They had a sense that the world was in crisis. Can you believe it? And here we are, all these years later, and the crisis is only worse. The climate is collapsing all around us. The possibility of nuclear war is very high on the scale of probability. The mess of the world continues. But under Article 19, our job is to try to get it going. So the main agencies under the World Parliament, the World Judiciary, and various levels of judiciary down to the district level. So there'll be district courts and regional courts and the World Supreme Court. And the World Attorney Generals and civilian police, the police force, the enforcement system under the Earth Constitution is non-military, no military. And very important, because if you have a decent world with enforceable law over every individual, you don't need a military. And if you have a military, something is wrong. And then the other agency I'd like to emphasize here is the World Ombudsman. It's an agency that will have offices all over the world in every one of the 1,000 electoral districts. And its job is to not only push and protect human rights, and it has legal authority to do so, but also to serve as a watchdog on the government itself, to make sure every agency in the government, from the judiciary to the executive to the parliament, is obeying the Constitution and protecting human rights. Okay, so that pretty much, let me just see if I know my 20 minutes is about up, and I don't want to go over, but the benches of the World Judiciary, there's 8 benches: human rights, criminal cases, civil cases, constitutional cases, and so on. And civilian world police. One other feature that I want to, and the functions of the World Ombudsman, one other feature that I just want to mention, and I'll end here, is that the World Executive, which is responsible to the World Parliament, and anybody in the World Executive can be removed for cause, it has limitations, because one of the things the founders, the writers of the Earth Constitution, had in mind was, of course, the danger of global tyranny of one sort or another. So the World Executive, first, in red, you can see the limitations that are there in the Constitution. It may not declare a state of emergency and suspend the Constitution. Second, it has no veto power over any act of Parliament. Third, it may not dissolve the World Parliament or any of its houses. Fourth, it may not violate or suspend any provision of the Constitution or world law. 5, it may not refuse to spend the budget approved by Parliament in the ways that the Parliament directs. 6, it must obey all the decisions of the world courts. 7, it has no police or enforcement powers of its own. As we saw a moment ago, the enforcement system is independent. The enforcement system is responsible to the Parliament directly and is independent of the World Executive. Okay, so there's the Constitution. We symbolize this wholeness, this integrative unity and diversity of the Earth Constitution by the Taurus. I'm bringing that up again so you can see it here, and it is represented in this fairly well-known Earth Constitution mandala that is there on our websites and many other places. The Earth Constitution, the authorities, the government, and the people integrated in a bottom-up and top-down synergy that will transform human life on this planet entirely. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you for your attention, and we'll see if we have questions.
Thank you so much for that, Glenn. That was a wonderful, concise presentation, and I feel like I learned a lot. You went through a lot of content. We have a couple of questions in the chat, but I want to start by asking why you believe it's important to emphasize the term world government opposed to world governance.
Yeah, it's a good question, Erica. All the way back in 1996, I believe it was, there was a major study about the global system that came out from a Blue Ribbon Commission. And they went through all the many global problems that we have, the problem of danger of war, repeated wars, environmental collapse, poverty, and so on. And they said, and they recommended, it was called Our Global Neighborhood. And they recommended that everybody be nice to each other. Everybody work together. And it recommended that we slowly evolve methods of governance, because they didn't want to frighten the nations, right? A lot of the nations are just crazy about their sovereignty, right? And let's face it, that craziness about sovereignty is exactly the problem, right? The problem is militarized sovereign nations. I go into this in some of my books, but this concept of sovereignty means independence. And you and I can be a sovereign individual protected by human rights and by society. That's a good thing, right? Some sovereign things are good. But if a nation claims to be sovereign, it implies it recognizes no authority above itself. It has the right to go to war if it decides it's in danger. And this is a disaster for the planet. So we need government. We don't need governance.
I think that's really interesting. There tends to be that walking of that line, more willingness to talk about governance instead of leaning to the word government. And perhaps that has to do with those anxieties you talk about. This next question comes from the chat. It comes from John Cowan. And I think it relates to exactly what you were talking about. What are the limits of the world government versus nations? And how do we get from here in this nation state sovereignty mindset to your vision of an Earth Constitution?
Also a very good question that I don't have an answer to. But except in, there's no easy answer. If there was an easy answer, people would have solved this problem long ago, because the World Federalist Movement, as you know, came out of World War I, where some of the members of the Women's League for Peace and Freedom, International League for Peace and Freedom, said, this is crazy. We need a world authority that can prevent this kind of breakdown of sovereign nations killing one another. If that's the problem, the people say we need it's the law that gives us the peace, the enforceable law that makes peace, right? Canada is a fairly peaceful place. United States in many places is peaceful because we live under the rule of law here, right? But if someone tells me, well, law doesn't count if you feel threatened, right? If I feel threatened by my neighbors, the law doesn't matter. You have the right. You're a sovereign person. You have a right to take your machine gun and go wipe out those neighbors, right? That's prescription for chaos. And the Earth Constitution, there's two problems in this question, as far as I can see. One is the psychological problem. How do we get people to see this, to convert to this? One is to get them to understand there's a difference between self-determination and sovereignty. So think of the sovereign nations. The cry for self-determination many of the African nations didn't become sovereign until the 1960s, right? And are they self-determining now? No, they're in debt to the IMF and the World Bank. They're influenced by every multinational corporation that's bigger than them that wants to go in there and take their resources and so on. They're desperate in their poverty. They're full of chaos and corruption because the rich of the world are there buying off this faction or that faction, or the United States is in there with some proxy war. That's not sovereignty, right? That's not self-determination. Self-determination takes place only within a civilized framework where society as a whole empowers the self-determination of its units or its members, right? The state of Virginia, where I live, has a certain self-determination because it's protected by the U.S. Constitution, right? Self-determination is not the same as sovereignty. Without law over everybody means the big and the powerful will always take advantage of the weak, and they have no real sovereignty, no real self-determination. So it's important for people to begin to understand that. And the second thing is, as I mentioned earlier, under the Earth Constitution, Article 19, we are directed to start it, right? We're directed to actually begin doing it. And we've got the 1,000 World Electoral Districts. In Toronto, you're in one of those districts, so you could actually begin registering as voters, and before long we're going to have secure online voting. We're trying to start it, and in all ways, the Provisional World Parliament, the first session of which was in Brighton, England, 1982. Has had 15 sessions. The 15th session was in New Delhi, India, just last year, 2021. And so the Provisional World Parliament works as a parliament. It legislates needed legislation to activate the various agencies in the Constitution, activate the elaborate the intent of legislation and so on. So we're working on that concrete level. And of course, we have limited resources, but if we're lucky enough that some people with resources see the significance of what we're doing, it could spread very rapidly, right? It's a matter of resources. Okay.
I'm sensing accountability, and this world government would play a really significant role in holding nations accountable, whereas right now they don't have that. And another really interesting point you bring up is sort of war, the economy of war that incentivizes nation states to behave in this way and indulge in maybe the lowest common instincts of our international system. How do you foresee this Earth Constitution playing a significant role in abolishing war and the economies that depend on war, that thrive because of it?
The very first article of the Earth Constitution, and the very first point in that article, is that the purpose of the Constitution is to abolish war and to disarm the nations, right? So disarming the nations is important, and the Constitution sets up, or the Provisional World Parliament has set up disarmament agencies. The Constitution calls for disarmament agencies that can study the problem and study how to do it systematically and carefully. There's kind of a model. You may know the work of Scott Ritter, who is a former UN weapons inspector and former US Marine, who worked on the nuclear weapons treaties that the US and the Soviet Union had going back in the 1980s and 1990s. Real progress was made, right? The threat of nuclear war was really diminished because they were working out systematically and carefully with inspections, with transparency, how to do this. It can be done. Now, the Constitution, first of all, in Article 2 says the people of Earth are sovereign. right? Nations are no longer sovereign. In fact, they're not sovereign. They call themselves sovereign, and sovereignty is a matter of power right now, but they have no legitimacy as sovereign nations. Legitimacy means you are capable, your government is capable of satisfying the common good of the people. But the common good of the people cannot be satisfied anywhere because the common good is now global. It's not local. Government of Canada cannot protect the environment of the world. It cannot stop, cannot end nuclear weapons and so on. So the government of Canada is technically not legitimate. And the sovereignty needs to be translated to the world. And therefore, in the House of Nations, you're going to have 300 representatives representing the nations, chosen in any way they want to, but they will not be representing militarized sovereign nations. They'll be representing groups of people who have common identities, common backgrounds, common histories, Chinese, Japanese, or whatever, but they won't be representing sovereign nations claiming they have a right to militarize.
This next question is going to come from Norbert DaCosta in the chat, our president at the Toronto branch. Under Region 14, India and Pakistan, Afghanistan, and perhaps Iran are a part of the same region. Would the people from those countries in conflict work together in a single region?
Interesting question. Yes, the Constitution calls for world electoral districts. Like in the United States, we have the House of Representatives, and they're supposed to be from roughly equal population districts. The Constitution, the world electoral administration would not allow for this gerrymandering and all that crap that goes on in the United States. They would be equitable districts. So and the Constitution calls for contiguous districts as much as possible and conforming to global boundaries as much as possible. But if you look at the way the Constitution, the Parliament is created, as well as the various agencies under the world government are created, all of them are required to include diversity. In fact, none of the world judiciary, the world executive, the world ombudsman, and the world police, and the world attorneys general, all of them are run by a presidium of 5 chosen by the World Parliament from one of each of the 5 continental divisions of the world. So there's always one from Asia, always one from Europe, always one from North America, South America, Africa. All right. So what the Constitution does is, and this is true of all the agencies in the integrative complex as well. Everything in the Constitution integrates people from around the world. Some UN agencies do that kind of thing too. And you think of Auroville in India, where people from all over the world work together, you know. So it creates a structure which helps overcome these regional animosities, right? It helps create a new culture, an integrated unity and diversity culture. And of course, the educational programs of the Earth Constitution, including our educational programs now in the provisional world stage, all emphasize the unity and diversity. We have to begin thinking of ourselves first as world citizens, first as human beings, and then loyal to our regional differences. That's fine, but those regional differences are not absolute, as they think they are now, you know. And so this requires a mind change on the part of the people. But my argument is a dialectical argument. I argue that changing the system helps change people's mindset, and changing people's mindset, if we work on that, it helps change the system. We need to do both at once. We can't say, well, first they got to change the attitude, then we can have world government. It isn't going to work that way. We've got to work on both at the same time. It's the best I can do with it.
I quite like that takeaway in the end. I think that Hegel and Marx would be smiling at that reflection, a little handshaking each other. This question comes from Julia Morton-Marr in the chat. You have done a lot of good work, Glenn, so Prices there.
Thank you.
How is this different from other bureaucracies or the middle powers?
What are the middle powers? I'm not clear on that.
I'm actually not sure.
Oh,
Okay.
well,
Perhaps.
how is it different from other bureaucracies? Well, I tried to indicate some of that in my brief presentation, with the model of the torus and so on, because it's not a top-down bureaucracy that imposes something. Right now, we have this debate whether that Donald Trump made famous when he cut all the regulations in this country. He said, we have to let the capitalists do their thing. They're the creative ones, and we can't constrict them. There's this debate between bureaucracy but I'm thinking my study of the Earth Constitution makes me think that it's going to not be a top-down bureaucracy imposed upon people. The important thing is for people, as Habermas himself, the great German philosopher, says, the important thing is for people to think that they are authors of the regulations, right? And if I'm the Provisional World Parliament has created, in one of its articles, it created something called the Global People's Assemblies, because every single world electoral district will have 8 million people in it at the current population of the world. And so we created something called Global People's Assembly to try to get people involved in the democratic process, involved with their representative in its office and so on, discussing the issues. And so when this goes up to the World Parliament, and the World Parliament begins to make rules and regulations, economic and political and social, so people have to see that this is the common good that they themselves care about, as well as their individual good. They have to see the unity of the common and the individual good, and that they have participated in this new energizing way of operating in the world.
Our next question is going to focus more on the configuration of some of the bodies. It comes from Mike Nickerson. Rather than having people campaigning to get positions in the House, might they want the position to be possibly selected through population draft or from people who don't particularly want the job?
There are different options that people have proposed for choosing. The Constitution says it will be elected. They will be elected, but it leaves open the meaning of what an election is, right? It doesn't necessarily. One of the things we've studied and we're concerned about is the kind of elections that are winner take all elections. You get 51% of the vote, and you leave out 49% of the people, and that's a real problem. And so, but there are other ways of doing, for instance, the rating system, where you rate your candidates in the order of preference and so on, and it allows for a much more flexible, much more what I would call a much more democratic system. And I think that's the Constitution insists that it has to be democracy, and democracy itself is hard to define. I'm working on that now in my new book, defining it, democracy. But one of the things that I emphasize is that there is a tradition in democratic theory called that focuses on what they call positive freedom. And very often in especially in Western countries, US and Canada, we have this conception of negative freedom, in the sense that, coming from John Locke, in the sense that people have these a priori rights. I have the right to own property. I have the right to own a gun, and so on. And that my freedom isn't somehow a struggle against the authority of government, which tries to restrict my freedom. But the democratic tradition of positive freedom says, if you think of it differently, right, that we work together to maximize the freedom of each by having real equality, not rule of the rich, not corruption in government, but real democratic equality, which gives us the integrity of government, which is concerned with empowering everybody, so that my freedom is my ability to live my life, fulfill the life of my community, because I'm empowered by my surroundings. I'm not struggling against my surroundings. So I think that's the way to think about democracy myself.
So I have a question about the House of Councillors, and how do we ensure that their nominations are truly based on the knowledge and experience and the value that the candidate will bring, and that those nominations are not influenced by existing global power dynamics, which, as you've said, they're deeply rooted, and moneyed interests have their connections in lots of different places. So is there a sort of process by which these candidates would be held to ensure that they're not beholden to some of those existing power dynamics?
There is not. And I think if we're going to create a decent planetary society, we've got to stop someplace, right? We can't, there's no magic bullet, right? There's no way to ensure, right? In 1,000 electoral districts, there's no way to ensure they don't get nutcases elected. Even though with global people's assemblies and people participating, which is a big winnowing factor, you look at the U.S. Congress; it's full of nutcases, right? And all we can do is our best. But one thing that is always in the back of my mind that I write about in some of my books is that human beings are in the process of growth. Right? We're in there's many psychologists have indicated that we grow from an egoistic level when we're children. You think of the 14-year-old, me, and so on, and we grow to an ethnocentric level in which we assimilate our culture, and we begin to look at the whole world through the lens of our culture. But if we keep growing, we become world-centered people. We become human beings first and global citizens first. And the ethnocentric part recedes and diminishes and so on. So I think I was saying something about this a little earlier, in this dynamism where we work to create the structures that are going to help influence people's consciousness, and we try to influence people's consciousness in order to create those structures. I think that that this is a tremendously hopeful possibility that we human beings. There's no way to ensure that it will work, but I think it's a very hopeful option that we have, that we can create a mature society in which mature people are elected into the House of Councillors.
Thank you for that response. The next question comes from Marjolaine Snipe from the chat. In the House of Nations, reps from nation states are given a place. Is it not so that for our common future of the Westphalian nation-state system must be superseded with the House of Nations, the nation-state system as such will be confirmed? Is that desirable? I can repeat the question if you need. It's a longer one.
I think I understand. The Constitution in Article 18 makes provision for amendments. Like any good constitution, it is a constitution that's open for growth. It's open for changing as the world changes and human consciousness changes and so on. The present constitution is an attempt to create a new world. As I said in Article 2, it makes the people of Earth sovereign. right? They're the ultimate authority and they're representatives in the World Parliament. But it does retain the nations, not as sovereign, but as social political entities and so on. But one thing the Constitution does not do, which I think is interesting, is define what a nation is. So it really, in our view, it opens up the concept of nation to include those who are now excluded. For example, Palestinians. Why not have a Palestinian nation, right? And get rid of this terrible oppression from Israel. How about the Kurds? Why not have a Kurdish nation, right? We could use the transitional concept of a House of Nations to, which are no longer sovereign nations, to solidify people's aspirations for independence or self-realization. And at the same time, there are writers who have said that, you know, a nation is really just, as they've historically developed, is just an arbitrary putting together by the colonists of diverse peoples. They might want to break up into more nations, right? But it has to be democratic, it has to be nonviolent, and it has to satisfy the democratic process. You know, so I don't think that this. I think this is a transitional thing, where we're including the concept of nations and people's current self-identities, and yet we're creating a system that's going to help them transcend those very identities.
So might there be a process through which some of these groups that don't identify with the nation state under which they've been categorized under could identify their desire to be represented separately, or would this just, it's by population?
The Provisional World, the House of Peoples is inevitably by population, right? The House of Peoples, and that means you know, in the case of small islands in the Caribbean or whatever, you have to have a number of different islands, or right now nations, within one world electoral district, right? But in the terms of nations, the Constitution, the World Parliament would have to consider the concept of nations, and if some group of people wants to be recognized as a nation, it has the authority to do that, right? And it would be a democratic process. You would, you know, the other nations would want to discuss it as well. But there wouldn't be this animosity like there is between Israel and Palestine right now, where one nation would say, "Oh, absolutely not," because under this new framework, the idea is the self-empowerment of peoples, within an empowering framework. It's no longer this struggle of my culture versus your culture, my religion versus your religion, and so on.
So the next question moves to more judicial aspects. As with other violations of Earth law, they would be brought under the rule of law and punished for this behavior then. Is this on the individual level?
Yes, you know, one of the traditional criticisms of the sovereign nation state system is that heads of state, George W. Bush, who invaded Iraq, he lives in luxury on his farm now, retired, right? He should be in jail. He's a criminal, right? And one of the problems of the sovereign nation state system is that there is no effective way for prosecuting people who do things under the authority of government, right? The Nazis said, "Oh, we're just obeying orders. Isn't that what you do in your?" And the Nuremberg trials, which ultimately, as we know, led to the 1948 Genocide Convention and the International Criminal Court, they're a very weak and hesitant step forward toward making individuals accountable, but they're not. right? Right now, President Biden and President Putin should both be in jail for that war in the Ukraine. They're not, right? So we need a world in which individuals are held accountable. Now, the Constitution does emphasize progressively creating a world that is more and more nonviolent. So it's under Article 10, where it talks about the world enforcement system. It specifies a number of ways laws can be enforced through financial penalties or restrictions of one sort or another that are not a matter of punishing people, right? Ultimately, even punishment, where violent criminals are concerned, they can be arrested, and it says that they should be arrested with minimum force. And as technology changes, the Provisional World Parliament has said the world police need to use non-violent means of arrest and so on. So the whole trajectory is to minimize the criminal penal aspect of law, which is now so strong and so brutal in the United States, for example, and to the more civilized we become, the more law-abiding we become, the enforcement system becomes less of a repressive system and more of a nonviolent system which keeps order with a minimum of what is necessary.
I want to take a portion of one question from the chat and combine it with sentiments expressed by a few people I've seen in the chat. So I want to look at this question from Selena Garcia, where she asks about how the system might deal with modern slavery. And the second part I want to combine is the sentiment a lot of people are mentioning a author, Derek Paul, and his novel, or his book, I should say, A Leap to an Ecological Economy, and how we have to change our economic system in order to see that change. And since a lot of modern slavery is based on our economic reality, I wanted to know your thoughts on changing the system, or perhaps transitioning away to address sort of the elephant in the room that's modern slavery. Most of our things are made by people that suffer.
If the Selena Garcia who is asking this question is the one that I've known in Costa Rica and known for years, I want to say hello. I don't know if it's the same person. But
yes, I am.
Oh, thank you. Okay. The capitalist system, in my new book that I described at the beginning of my talk, called on Human Dignity and World Order, the world order is an integration today of militarized sovereign nation states and global capitalism. Many scholars, world system scholars, say you can't separate those two. Nations operate on behalf of their own wealthy classes, their own ruling classes. The US does this all the time. You know, it's not to our advantage to have this war in Ukraine. It's the advantage of the industrial military complex. They're making billions of dollars and so on. At the same time, we can't even get adequate health care here in the United States. And modern slavery is a consequence of capitalism, in my view. Now, the Earth Constitution doesn't use the word socialism, it doesn't use the word communism, it doesn't use the word capitalism, but it does create in Article 8 a system of global public banking, where the money system is used for the common welfare of the people of Earth, not for private power, not for private wealth. So in my understanding of that immense and brilliant, I think brilliant innovation in the Earth Constitution, you can't have capitalism as we now, with the unlimited accumulation of private wealth, which means that, as I recently read from Oxfam, 26 people own 50% of the wealth in the whole world. I mean, it's just absurd. It's criminal. And it's this kind of, not only is it this economic power that makes human slavery possible and probably inevitable, but it's the orientation of capitalism which takes human beings and turns them into commodities to be exploited for profit. Right? If I go to work in a factory, my labor is a commodity to that factory. It's something written into the ledger, and I can be replaced by someone else who might be cheaper in their wages or whatever. It commodifies human beings. Marx calls it reification. It turns us into things and so on. And the Earth Constitution, as I said earlier, is based on human dignity. It is not based on, it repudiates commodification. It repudiates militarized sovereign nation states, which are power centers. So I think slavery, modern slavery, which is a terrible problem, trafficking in women and children, it's all going on all over the world. It's a consequence of the economic system. And only if we change the fundamental system itself to one based on human dignity can we even begin to deal with that mess.
The next question comes from Rose Dyson from the chat. If world governance is to be based on proportional representation, doesn't that mean that the most populated areas and countries, such as China, some of which are predisposed to less democratic ways of thinking, are likely to emerge as dominant? Do you see this as a problem?
That is a consequence, right? The House of Peoples will have many people from China, many people from India. We need, but here's a very important thing. Do the people, we say the people in China are less democratic. Maybe there's a certain sense of going back to Confucianism and so on, but there's also the Tao also is associated with China and Buddhism, and it may be that if we create 1,000 world electoral districts and people see their electoral districts as representing them as autonomous, as allowing them to fulfill their aspirations, no longer being told, as the Chinese government does, you must work in this factory and you can't leave this factory and you gotta keep working and so on. And if people are liberated in their regional districts and they see that they have real input and real control in those districts, it seems to me that people's attitudes are going to change. I don't think unless, this is a kind of theme, from the beginning of my talk, we've got to find ways to structurally change the world to help people's attitudes change. And we've got to do other things to help their attitudes change at the same time. It's a cyclical, it's a dialectical process. But that's the thinking, my thinking and my hope. I haven't spent much time in China, but I spent a lot of time in India almost every year. And India is full of people who, even though India will have a large number of seats in World Parliament, it's full of people who are independently thinking, who are world citizens, who are concerned with the common good of humanity, concerned with the fate of humanity. I've met hundreds of them. And so that kind of thing gives me hope.
You see differing ideologies and values, perhaps even beyond just the example we were given, as presenting a meaningful obstacle to world government? Do you foresee that consensus on shared values and ideologies as being foundational to its start, or do you believe that there's space to bridge this gap, as you've sort of put it?
Well, one of the things I think of, I believe as a philosopher, is that there is a level of morality or a level of ethics that is universal, right? It's not all relative. In fact, any country that claims to be based on most of the constitutions, by the way, the majority of the constitutions in the world mention the word human dignity. right? And they may mean different things, and they may need to dialogue about exactly what that means. But I think that is a universal thing. And it's not that everybody believes in it, because something that's universal is true. You know, for instance, Rousseau in his Social Contract brilliantly distinguished between the will of all and the general will, what he called the general will. The general will is the rightness of the framework, of the democratic framework, the rightness of human liberty and an empowering framework. And that's different than the will of all, right? If in the United States, the will of all can elect a Donald Trump to office, or the will of the majority, right? That doesn't mean it's right, you know? And so there are universal principles that Jürgen Habermas talks about, the universal ethics of dialogue. We can dialogue with one another. Mahatma Gandhi said something similar. Mahatma Gandhi said, you know, he had a religious understanding that inside of every person was an Atman, the sacred, but we don't have to be religious to have some sort of sense of human dignity that's there in everybody. And there are foundational values that we need to come to terms with among ourselves. And I have every hope that this is a process that's going on in the world, even though right now we're in a terrible reaction because the old order in the world is disintegrating. Right, so people are becoming fascistic, and people are regressing to egoism. My church, my power, my identity politics. This is not what is foundational to being a human being. It's that human dignity that we all share, that inwardness. And this is what is emerging slowly worldwide. And I think, you know, in contrast to this regressive fascism that's operating a lot in the world, there are millions and millions of people who are identified as world citizens, who realize that we have to have love and justice and a common human situation on this planet if we really want a future on the planet at all.
You mentioned faith and religion, and we have a question in the chat that pointed out the Parliament of World Religions. And they were wondering, what role do you see faith leaders playing regarding a world government and advocating for and helping the idea of a world constitution gain traction, if you see any?
You may or may not know that in the last Parliament of World Religions that was in Toronto, the Earth Constitution had a booth there. I was there. And we were talking to many people from many different religions. They were interested. They were taking copies. We were handing out copies of the Constitution right and left. And they were interested in it. And one of the keynote speakers that had been invited there was Swami Agnovich, who comes from the Hindu tradition in India. Swami Agnovich was one of our vice presidents. He's passed away a couple of years ago, but he was a faith leader. He wrote a famous book about global spirituality and integration of the world religions. I think it's very powerful. It's a very important movement. The ecumenical dialogical development among world religions. It's a very it seems to me that it points to a kind of spirituality that is a potential in all of us. And Swami Agnovich, who for years, my wife and I stayed with him when we went to India. He had a room in his apartments that he would put us up in. I had long conversations with him about spirituality and so on, and was really encouraged at his vision. And he saw the Earth Constitution as integral to that.
We just had a sort of an addition that I feel goes well with this question I've just asked you, is the role that you see for Indigenous peoples and their representation in an Earth Parliament or Earth Constitution.
No, Indigenous people have a unique spirituality in many cases that we really, I think, could be very helpful to, that we should pay attention to, that we should listen to. They're in harmony with nature and so on, so we can learn from them as we have to convert the world system to one that is in harmony with nature. And as we said, it might be there might be possible if they see it as necessary. Maybe it isn't necessary that the nations of the Indigenous people in Canada and the United States, the Sioux Nation, the Mohawk Nation, they could be recognized as nations again in the World Parliament if people democratically chose to do so. But they might not even need that, because if we really unite as a world, and in the World Electoral District where the Mohawk Nation is located, they might the district might be very interested in integrating them into the processes of that district and learning from them, and they would see no reason why we have to be a separate nation again.
Would it be contingent basically mainly on the population? Because one challenge that comes with representing Indigenous peoples is, as we know, their population has dwindled as a result of specific targeting and practices, some since the beginning of colonization, just simply them becoming ill, and then more intentional devious ones like the genocide through residential schools and other. Yeah, it's all over the world. I know mostly about Canada, but there are nuances for Indigenous populations all over the world are affected by this. Is there a way that their representation could be elevated in light of the fact that many of the voices who would have been represented are unfortunately, tragically, no longer here to do that anymore?
Well, that has to be up to the World Parliament. I mean, I could give you my opinion, but under the Earth Constitution, it sets up a democratic process, and there's no way that I can see of that would be democratic, that would prejudice even those people I think are wisest. I would say, oh, if it were up to me, Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi would be on the executive council, right? But it's not up to me. It's up to the processes established by the Earth Federation under the Earth Constitution, and those of us who appreciate Indigenous culture and so on could be and probably should be saying, let's listen to these people, right? Let's look out sources of wisdom as we transition from a capitalist society predicated on endless growth, which you cannot have on a finite planet, to a society of peace and justice and people finding joy and meaning in life itself, not in striving for ever more and ever more consumption and so on. So we have to somehow trust the process and each of us point out what we think is important in it, so that what is winnowed out is the chaff, and the wheat, the best, the insight, the wisdom, the spirituality remains.
This next question is another one from Rose Dyson. So many questions have already emerged around issues of child exploitation, human trafficking, and although not entirely related to capitalism, or they are, but the notions of rights and freedoms and amusing ourselves to death. What do you see the role of media in the Earth Constitution, especially in the new digital age with artificial intelligence and, again, endless access to our devices?
Yeah. There isn't much about media in the Earth Constitution. There is, as I said, a world financial system that takes the global financial system out of the hands of the banking cartels and the super rich and puts them in the democratic hands of the people of Earth. Right now, vast media empires like the Fox empire, which is now, as you know, in the United States, is now being sued for $1.6 billion for lies, right, that it tells publicly. And we need a world media system that is that deals with these terrible and difficult issues of freedom of speech, yet not the misuse of speech to deceive or to. And one of the keys to having a good media system like that is to get rid of media based on capitalism. You know, people say, "Oh, you don't want the government giving all the media." You know, like the BBC can't give us all the truth. We need independent media, but there are very few independent media, right? Most media is owned by huge media corporations, and they have a vested interest in slanting the news in their own direction. Now, one thing the Earth Constitution does, which I think is very interesting in Article 8, is say that for elections, every candidate for election, from the lowest to the highest level, will get a booklet, what it calls a booklet at that time. Now it might be a website, right? But it'll be a website of a certain size with a certain content. The website will review the main issues that are being contended and allow each candidate to give their views on the issues within the same space framework. You know, to me, that's the basis of a media revolution right there. No longer secret Republican backers backing some outside nutcase in Georgia or wherever with millions of dollars in dark money that no one knows about. That stops under the Earth Constitution. And so I think that provision is very clear, and it could be extended. You know, if the Earth Constitution recognizes that elections need to be on the issues and on the candidates' views on the issues and the real thing that's going on. If it recognizes that, then it recognizes that the media must be designed in such a way that we have a variety of voices that are speaking with integrity and independence about the world by thoughtful people.
This is going to be our final question before we close out the Q&A. I want to know your response to concerns raised about the ability of a global government to adapt to evolving geopolitical, social, economic, and environmental challenges in a timely and effective manner. How do you foresee this being adaptable in the face of all of these ever-changing dynamics?
It's a difficult question. It's a good question, but a difficult one in the sense that if we listen to the International Committee on Climate Change, 1,000 scientists from around the world, the world is rapidly descending into climate chaos. And at the same time, imperialist nations like the US is adamant that it's not going to let China and Russia become independent powers. It wants global hegemony and so on. So we've got this complex of struggles of nations. At the same time, the global environment is collapsing. On the empirical level, it looks very, very difficult and very, very difficult. The sooner we get the Earth Constitution in place, the sooner we have a chance of survival, in my view. But what the Earth Constitution does is give human beings, as I said earlier, the ability to plan, the ability to design a world that is for the benefit of everyone. Article 4 of the Earth Constitution makes the oceans of the Earth public property, right? They belong to the people of Earth. not the Japanese who are out there hunting all the whales to extinction, right? They belong to the people of Earth, not the oil companies who are pumping out this poisonous stuff into because they're making billions of dollars. And the Earth Constitution puts that in the public domain. So the World Parliament could deal with those things effectively. It's the same with the air. Who does the air belong to? The air that you and I are breathing is full of impurities coming from the factories of Ohio or across the ocean from the factories in China. And because they're sovereign nations, they have the right to pump all this poison into the atmosphere over their nation. But that atmosphere belongs to all of us, right? So this is the fundamental thing. We have to begin thinking as planetary citizens and thinking that this planet really belongs to us and that these sovereign nation states really are illegitimate. They no longer have a legitimate claim to authority. They have power, and we need to resist that power non-violently. Violence is not going to do it, but we have to change the system, which makes all these terrible difficulties possible. And I think that, as I was saying earlier, that the Earth Constitution, because it is a evolving document under Article 18, amendments can be had, and it even requires it. It says within 10 years of the first operative stage, they must have a constituent assembly to examine the Earth Constitution and how it's designed. Right?
Yeah.
And every 20 years after that, it requires another constituent assembly to re-examine the Earth Constitution to make sure it's the most effective and for the well-being of the people on the planet. So it is designed for adaptability. It's designed for change, but we have to have the fundamental structure in place before we can even begin that kind of adaptability and change on behalf of the common good of the people of Earth.
Thank you so much, Glenn. That was a really tough question, and you did a wonderful job of answering it. It was a delight to hear your presentation, and it was even more rewarding to see all the wonderful questions in the chat and hear your responses. So thank you again for your time.
Thank you, Erica. Appreciate it.
Peter,
Oh,
over to you.
so it's my turn.
It is.
Well, Glenn, I just wanted to give you, on behalf of the World Federalist Movement Toronto, just an immense thank you for your presentation. This is such an awesome change and perspective, and I've been studying for at least 10 or more years democracy, capitalism, and Derek Paul's leap to an ecological economy. But this is truly an amazing framework that you've developed. So just thank you so much on our behalf for such an amazing presentation.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Peter.
Alex.
So,
Hi, thanks, Dr. Martin, for that wonderful presentation. So I'm Alex McIsaac. I'm the Executive Director of World Federalist Movement Canada. Just like to take this opportunity to let you know about a conference that we're hosting on June 3rd. So it's open to for anyone to register around the world. So we'll be joined by a lot of other World Federalist Movement organizations that are under WFMIGP in other countries. So the conference will feature presentations, panels, a trivia event, simulation of a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly committee. The topic of the conference will be on how UNPA could address nuclear nonproliferation and disarmament. It will run all day from 10 a.m. to 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on June 3rd, allowing participants from around the world to join on one or more of the events throughout the day. So after the opening ceremonies for the conference, we'll have two presentations, one of course by Dr. Martin, another by Andreas Bummel, and they'll be on the topics of an Earth Constitution again and a United Nations Parliamentary Assembly respectively. The presentations will be followed by a panel between the two speakers so that they can discuss their respective models for a democratic world parliament. The conference will then move to what we call a model UNPA event, in which all are free to participate in the simulation of a UNPA committee. The committee will be tasked with creating world policy to achieve a world without nuclear weapons. The simulation will run over 3 sessions with 2 intermissions, during which participants will have the option of attending firstly, a presentation by the Honorable Douglas Roche on how we can move towards a war-free world, and later participating in a fun trivia event challenging participants' knowledge of global governance topics. The conference will come to a close with our closing ceremonies, of course, in which we will present the resolution passed by the simulated UNPA committee, hopefully finding an agreed upon path towards nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. You can visit the conference page on our website for more information and to register now. I'll put the link in the chat, or I already have, but I'll put it again. Or thank you, Erica, for doing that, actually. Otherwise, you can find information and registration links by visiting www.wfmcanada.org and navigating towards the events section of the website. So once again, thank you very much, Dr. Martin, for your very informative presentation. And I hope to see you all at the World Federalist Conference on June 3rd. Over to you, John.
Right. Thank you, Alex. And I'm a member of the board of Toronto branch. And I just wanted to update those of you who may have been involved in one of our earlier meetings discussing the UN Emergency Peace Service concept with Peter Langille. The Toronto branch is working hard and getting close to preparing a petition to send to the government through the House of Commons to require their response about suggesting that the government promote the idea of a UN Emergency Peace Service at the UN itself. So stay tuned for that. There will be an announcement to everybody when we're ready for signatures for that. Then Norbert, I think you had some concluding remarks.
So Dr. Martin, Erica, Peter, Alex, and John, thank you very much for your contribution to this event. Dr. Martin, I think every one of us have actually raised our level of awareness to a large extent as to the possibilities of a future world where we can all work together under the umbrella of global governance with Earth Constitution. Thank you once again. In closing, I remind all, once again, if you are not already a member or donor of World Federalist Movement, please consider joining, becoming a member or donating. If you're below 30 years of age, a student or a person of limited income, membership is free. If you are already a member or donor, we are immensely thankful. Regardless of whether you are a member or donor, we appreciate your participation in this event, our previous events, and a future event, and look forward to seeing you all on June 3rd. Thank you all, and goodbye.